So what are the different components of a distribution? So previously we learned about the shape of a distribution, saying basically you have to look at the tail. So now there's some other components that we want to look at. The first one is going to be a cluster. A cluster is basically where you have a large grouping of the data. So in this case right here, a cluster would have been all of this here, because it's all together in one group. So you have this large group of data here, and then there's something way off to the side. This is a cluster, and basically the opposite of a cluster is an outlier. So this data point right here would be considered an outlier. Now, between the outlier and the cluster would be this space right here. This space right here would be considered a gap. This space right here would be considered a gap. So we've taken care of clusters, gaps, and outliers. The only thing left to understand is that the highest point of a data set is called the peak. And so the peak would just be, you can see that the highest point is right here, which is the peak. So the peak is at 7. The outlier was at 1. There was a gap from 1 to 4. And then from 4 to 10 was a cluster. So let's see how we can put that all together. So this question asks, which of the following are accurate descriptions of the distribution below? Well, let's see. The first thing says that the distribution has an outlier. Well, as you can see, the majority of the data is here. So there's a cluster here. There's a gap between 5 and 20. And yes, there is an outlier right here between 0 and 5. So the distribution has a peak from 40 to 45. Well, is the peak is the highest place. But is the peak from 40 to 45? Yes, it is. So that's true too. And obviously, if the first two are true, the answer can't be none of the above. All right. So which of the following are accurate descriptions? The distribution has a peak at 6 hours. Well, the peak is, 6 hours is right here, and that's not the peak. The peak is actually at 8. The distribution has a cluster from 7 to 9. So from 7 to 9, there's a lot of data there. So yes, that will be considered a cluster. And obviously, if one of them is true, the answer can't be none of the above. And so here we go. The distribution has a gap from 30 to 60. So 30 to 60, there's no data there. So yes, that's a gap. The distribution has a peak from 80 to 90. So the highest point would have to be from 80 to 90. And as you can see, that's not true. The peak would actually be from 70 to 80. The distribution has a gap from 11 to 12. So 11 to 12 is here. There's no gap there. There's data there. So that's wrong. The distribution has a cluster from 7 to 8. So 7 to 8 is right here. Yes, there's a cluster from 7 to 8. I'm sorry, that's not a cluster. That's a gap. There's a gap from 7 to 8. And so the answer would be none of the above. The distribution has a peak from 12 to 13. 12 to 13 is here. That is not the peak, so that's wrong. The distribution has an outlier. Yes, there's an outlier right here from 0 to 1. Just to make sure we understand, there's a cluster from 8 to 19, and there's a peak from 16 to 17. So yes, there is an outlier, and the peak is not from 12 to 13, it's from 16 to 17. This distribution, does it have an outlier? Yes, it does, at 10. Does the distribution have a cluster from 4 to 6? 4 is here, 6 is here. Yes, there's a cluster right there, because a cluster is basically comes before or after a peak. And so yes, there's a cluster here. There's another cluster here. There's a gap at 3 and a gap from 7 to 9. So that should be it. The distribution has an outlier. Yes, it does have an outlier. Does the distribution have a gap from 20 to 29? So here's 20 to 24. 20 to 29 would be here. No, that's not a gap. There's data there. The gap is from 5 to 19, so that's wrong. There's an outlier here, and there's a cluster from 20 to 49. And does the distribution have a gap? No, it does not. So the answer is just A, just an outlier. So that's really all you're doing. Once you understand what a cluster, a gap, a peak, and an outlier are, it's just a matter of going in and being able to identify them properly. So that's it. I hope it helps. Let's get it done.